Dr. Clay Mathis. Clay's director of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management at Texas A&M Kingsville, and is no stranger to BIF. He's both a frequent attendee and also has been a speaker a number of times at BIF, and is known for being a systems guy, if you will, and they teach a lot of the systems approach to beef production management at the King Ranch Institute, and we've asked Clay to take that approach and apply it to beef cattle sustainability. So we've talked over the last couple of days a lot about the beef value chain and sustainability issues, and I think as producers, I know I even struggle to sort of understand the concepts of sustainability, but then it becomes more complicated even when we try to deploy that set of frameworks on our own farm or ranch. And so we've asked Clay to help us with that a bit and help think through implementation of sustainability ideas and principles and how they might impact our ranching operations and influence our selection decisions over time, either as seed stock or commercial producers. A little background on Clay. Again, he's the director and endowed chair of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management at Texas A&M Kingsville. As director, Dr. Mathis leads the faculty and staff and oversees the teaching, outreach, and applied research efforts of the Institute. He maintains and develops a curriculum for the Master of Science in Ranch Management degree program and coordinates service work for partnering ranches across North America. In addition, he serves on the National Cattlemen's Beef Association Beef Quality Assurance Advisory Board, the United States Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and as a member of the East Foundation Professional Advisory Group. Alumni of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management Master's Degree Program during Dr. Mathis's tenure currently manage over 100,000 cows on more than 3 million acres of ranch land and wildlife habitat across 12 states, which include the managers of 4 of the 20 largest cow-calf operations in the United States. He's also led graduate students and faculty in the completion of over 120 service learning projects, providing production and business management recommendations to partnering ranches across North America. Dr. Mathis is a native of New Braunfels, Texas. He received his bachelor's in animal science and master's in physiology of reproduction from Texas A&M University. And in 1998, he earned a PhD from Kansas State University in ruminant nutrition. From 1998 to 2010, Dr. Mathis worked as a professor and extension livestock specialist at New Mexico State University. Dr. Mathis and his wife, Rhonda, are the proud parents of Morgan, Miles, and Amy K. Mathis. Dr. Mathis, we're just delighted to have you on the program again and look forward to your comments today.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to be on the Beef Improvement Federation Symposium program again this year, and man, a systems approach to beef cattle sustainability. I've got to tell you, this has been a real challenging topic for me, and I've been involved with the sustainability effort since the beginning of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and it really hasn't been until I went through the effort to try to pull together this information and present it to y'all today that I feel like I've got a solid grasp on beef cattle sustainability. So my hope is when we finish this program this afternoon that each of you will come away with at least a better understanding of what beef cattle sustainability means and what factors are at play in this whole beef cattle production system and the sustainability of the product that we raise. So with that, let's talk about systems thinking a little bit. And all systems thinking really is it's an approach. It's a mindset or a way of thinking. It's about looking at the whole, but also how the parts are interconnected, but never looking at the parts without keeping the big picture in mind. And so the reason we would use a systems approach to problem solving is, one, so that we can understand, And if we can understand challenges better, then we're more likely to be able to find leverage. Leverage for how we can overcome those challenges. So let's think about what the challenge is. I think if we can boil it down to a focusing question, the question is, why is sustainable beef production so challenging? And we have to start there with, what does sustainability mean? We've all kind of got an idea, and I think to many of us, what sustainability has really meant in most of our lifetimes, especially those that are closest to the production of beef, it's simply passing on the ranch or the beef enterprise to sustain the next generation while maintaining or improving the natural resources for generations to come. I think for so many of us, it's really that simple. But in recent years, it's become more complicated than that. It really isn't just about passing on the operation and doing a great job of producing beef. So if we look at what you heard about earlier today as well, which is some of the efforts of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, they've got a definition. And it's much broader than what we naturally gravitate towards with just succession from one generation to the next. The Global Roundtable envisions a world in which all aspects of the beef value chain are environmentally sound, socially responsible, and economically viable. So why is sustainable beef production so challenging? I think we have to start by looking at what are some of the challenging or some of the trends that are associated with beef production and its sustainability. And so I want to go through a list of some trends that I identified, and many of these I identified back, I believe 19 years ago for a presentation I made, but they're still true today. And so let's talk about these, and you just think about this as I go through this list, if you believe this trend to be true. The first is that we have an increasing world population, and as a result, we should see a trend towards increasing food demand. Ultimately, we hope that means to increase price for beef. With that increase in world population, though, we also see urban sprawl. And urban sprawl, often because there's a limited amount of land, leads to increased land values. Do you also believe the trend that towards increasing consumer interest in food production practices? A trend for more regulations and an increase in the complexity of doing business. I read an article, I believe 8 years ago, in a popular press, and it was addressing the complexity of business in the United States. And I'm not sure how they measured it, but they identified that the complexity of business increases by 6.7% per year in the United States. That means it takes just a little over a decade to double the complexity of business. That affects the environment in which we're producing it in the future, and that trend is upwards towards complexity. Would you also agree that there's a trend for the speed of technology development to be increasing? We've certainly seen that in past decades, in fact centuries, but I think we could probably agree that that trend will increase as well. What if we look at trends at the enterprise or ranch level, those things that we may be able to adapt to or impact some as individual producers? Some would say that we have an increase in climatic variation, which would be an increased frequency of drought. Do you believe that to be true? I think most of us agree that we've seen an increasing commodity and input costs for our production systems, and we would expect that trend to continue. But the challenge is commodity and input prices have been increasing at a faster rate than the price of the beef products that we sell. We already mentioned an increase in land values, but that has a significant impact at the ranch and enterprise level. I think many of us would also agree that there is a decrease in the willing and skilled ranch labor, or at least there's an increase in what it costs for us to hire those individuals with those skill sets that want to work in our industry. So when we look at these trends, and if we believe they're true, then can't we get a better idea of those challenges to the beef production sustainability if we tie those together. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I took those trends that we just discussed and I organized them into what's called a causal loop diagram. It just simply shows the cause and effect relationships that occur with these trends on our beef production systems, certainly in light of beef cattle sustainability. Let me show you this in a little bit bigger picture. Now, this causal loop diagram is way too complex to absorb all at once, and I realize that. And so my intention is that we'll break this down into pieces, and then we'll put these pieces back together. And what we want to do is rebuild this causal loop diagram so that we can understand from a systems level what's going on with beef sustainability and why it is so challenging to sustainably produce beef. So we're going to rebuild this. We're going to identify the relationships that are there so that in the end we can try to identify how we can find leverage and shape this system towards the outcomes that we're most interested in. So bear with me. We're going to go through each step of this, and I'm going to try to do that in a manner that we can understand. And I will also note, if you see on one of these lines in these cause and effect relationships an O, that simply means that the relationship is in the opposite direction. Okay? It's like a negative relationship. It happens in the opposite direction. For example, if we increase unit cost of production, we would decrease profitability. That would be in an opposite direction. Also note on this, we go all the way from the trends of world population and precipitation to the production of sustainable beef. Now let's break this down and look at it more closely. Let's start with the triple bottom line of sustainable beef. Back to the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef's envisionment of a world in which all aspects of the value chain are environmentally sound, which you can see over here on the far right, are socially responsible, and are economically viable. We have to have those three things in the triple bottom line to be able to produce sustainable beef, and we have to have beef product. So we're going to put all of those together. Now this economic viability, which is where we will start, think about its profitability. So we're using profitability to represent as a variable to represent economically viable, just like we're using environmental health to represent environmentally sound and socially acceptable for socially responsible. When we look at economic viability or profitability, in the big picture, we're looking at this throughout the entire beef supply chain, from the calves that are born all the way through when the consumer produces a beef product. Economic viability of the entire beef production and value chain system. For the purposes of this talk today, we're going to focus more so on the forage-based production, primarily cow-calf, just to minimize the complexities of the presentation that you're going to hear. At the heart of sustainable beef production is this reinforcing loop of continuous improvement. As we increase profitability, we increase the incentive to produce beef, which incentivizes improved management and cattle and natural resources. That increases beef production efficiency, which does two things. One, by improving efficiency, we can decrease unit cost of production and therefore increase profitability on the cost side of the profit equation. But on the revenue side of the profit equation, increasing efficiency, even if costs are unchanged, would yield increased beef production and therefore more revenue to increase profitability. And so this is a virtuous cycle when it is functioning in our favor, but it could also be a vicious cycle. And as we look at this cycle, this reinforcing loop, I think it's really important to point out that we have done very well in this area of improved cattle management and natural resources management, which has led to great strides in the efficiency of beef production. And so we have done this, but in large part it's because we had to. We had to because even now, beef production is very marginally profitable. And had we not had such great strides in efficiency, we certainly would not have been able to maintain the production systems that are producing the beef that we produce. And so we've got to be very happy for the strides that have been made here. We also might be a little concerned that we've already made the biggest strides. We've harvested the low-hanging fruit. And I'm not suggesting that we can't improve more, and there aren't greater bounds and efficiencies to be made, but we're going to have to work really hard to do that further. We also have to recognize when this virtuous cycle of continuous improvement is functioning on the positive and more profits are being made, then decisions are made to improve management because of opportunity that exists. Often that incentive or desire to produce beef leads to expanding cow numbers or number of stockers, certainly just trying to increase the number of animals and therefore the product that is going to come from those animals and therefore revenue. But when this cycle becomes a negative cycle, a vicious cycle, then the reduction in profitability creates an increase in risk of business failure, and we often operate in that with that fear driving decisions. And so that risk of failure leads to a need to increase production, and that can improve cattle management because of that responsiveness to that need because of fear of business failure. But another thing that it may do is it may lead to expanding cow numbers to increase revenue on that side of the profit equation as well. So when we keep those vicious versus virtuous cycles in mind on the profitability or economic viability of beef production, we have to also recognize that those external influences like precipitation create some limitations. You know, we can only follow this desire to increase cow numbers or respond to the need to increase production by increasing cow numbers according to the amount of grazable forage that's present. And that's dictated primarily by precipitation. And so as we have variations in precipitation, we certainly have upper limits to the number of cows or stockers that could be present. But we know that if we can increase those cows or stockers, we decrease the number of, or the fixed cost per animal unit, which decreases average animal unit cost, decreases unit cost of production, and therefore increases economic viability. And so this becomes a reinforcing loop towards expansion or maximizing cow numbers. It's simply limited by forage supply and demand. And if we take that a step farther, I think we have to recognize the real influence that drought, or the risk that drought creates on our forage-based beef production systems. Because if we think about precipitation and when it's low, so consider a drought year and forage supply is low, therefore grazable forage is low. When grazable forage is low, is declining or declines, we have to increase supplemental feeding, which increases average cost per animal unit. At the same time, and this is a longer term path, decreasing grazable forage due to drought increases our need to reduce grazing pressure, which ultimately can increase the number of cows that we might sell on a regionally drought suppressed market. And then there's a delay in time indicated by the hash marks on this arrow, and we buy back those cows or we raise replacements. If we're raising replacements, we're foregoing revenue from producing units. If we buy back those same cows as pregnant cows, we're buying them back on a market in which lots of people are probably wanting cows because it's greened up. And so we're selling on a low market and buying back on a high market. Ultimately, that increases average cow depreciation and average animal unit cost increases as well, which increases unit cost for production. So this is kind of the path that we see in the struggles with financially managing through a drought. And if we take away some of the discussion that we just had about drought and look at the other external influence on profitability, which is world population, which has some good and some bad to it. On the good side, world population growth, as we mentioned earlier, increases food demand, and we would expect that would lead to increased beef demand and therefore beef price. Urban sprawl, as a result of world population, increases land value, and although there's a lot of steps in between land value and unit cost of production, regardless of whether it's simply the tax rate on land going up on land that's already owned, or the purchase and financing and interest cost on more expensive land, urban sprawl leads to increased land values, which ultimately increases unit cost of production and drives profitability downward. I'm going to circle beef price here because we're going to come back to this in a few minutes, and this is really, really important. So keep thinking about beef price and the influence it has on this entire beef production system. We'll address that again in a minute. Let's go back to the triple bottom line. And now let's talk about or focus more on social acceptability of beef production and environmental health. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to tie those two variables into the continuous improvement loop that we talked about in the last. Remember this trend of increasing consumer interest in food production practices? So this trend is captured in two reinforcing cycles, a cycle of social acceptability and that of being environmentally healthy or environmentally sound. And let's follow this loop through as a virtuous cycle, starting with social responsibility. As we increase the social acceptability of beef production, we increase consumer trust and therefore beef demand and therefore beef price, revenue, and ultimately profitability, which drives this continuous improvement reinforcing loop. And if we continue to improve in beef production, then we improve the management of cattle and natural resources, which leads to improved cattle well-being and therefore a greater perception of being socially responsible, which leads to more consumer trust. So that's a social acceptance reinforcing loop. At the same time, improved natural resources management leads to greater environmental health, as does improved efficiency of beef production leads to greater environmental health, and therefore increased social acceptance of beef production. So we have to ask the question, today, are these virtuous cycles or are these vicious cycles? We certainly want these to be virtuous cycles. In fact, these have to be virtuous cycles. The mission of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef was established to advance, support, and communicate continuous improvement, that's this continuous reinforcing loop, of sustainability across the entire beef value chain. This may be idealistic in the minds of some, but we have got to have a reinforcing virtuous cycles where greater environmental soundness, social acceptance of our beef production practices lead to the support of profitability so that we can continue to produce beef. So let's return to our focusing question. Why is sustainable beef production so challenging? So as I said we would do, we broke down the causal loop diagram and we put it back together. And what we're left with is a lot of complexity. And I think that anyone who followed along with the relationships that I presented can identify where there's a whole lot more relationships that aren't even represented here. We didn't even talk about improvement in cattle management and what it has done over the years to the quality of cattle and how that's improved the price that we receive for cattle, but it's there. And there's a number of other relationships as well. But I think this is complex enough. We have to ask ourselves now, so what do we do with this information and how does it help us make decisions in the future? Let's go back to the important trends that we identified earlier. And let's talk about these individually once more. Increasing world population and food demand is pretty good for us. Increasing speed of technology development, something else that could be pretty good for us. We are challenged by the world population's growth and its effect on land values. I think as producers, we're also challenged by the consumer interest in food production practices and what that often leads to at times with some misunderstandings. And certainly we have challenges by the complexity of business increasing and regulations that are also associated with just a growing world population as well, and societal advancements. At the ranch and enterprise level, an increasing climatic variation and drought's always going to be a challenge for production of any type of agricultural commodities. Increasing commodity input prices, land values, and the ability to hire willing and skilled laborers. I've got to tell you, when you come down and look at all of this together, we are really counting on this increase in price that would result from growing world population and increase in food demand. See, that's the one thing that rises all operations. As we can sell our product for more money, we can cover more cost. It's that simple. If we look at the ranch and enterprise level, each one of these trends points towards higher cost. And that's why we've seen cost advancing at a rate that's faster than beef prices. So where do we find leverage to overcome these challenges? Well, as an industry, I think we have to look at consumer trust. I think as an industry, it's also improved cattle management, but still the greatest leverage is probably consumer trust improvement. At the beef enterprise level, I think it's improved cattle management. Let me expand on each of these a little bit in the following slides. Why consumer trust? It's a result of social acceptability. Think about social acceptability, increasing consumer trust, beef demand, and beef price. See, beef demand, if it's driven by two things, if it's one by food demand, and that just creates an appetite for the world for food, but it's trust and the consumer's willingness to buy our product that really dictates how much of that world demand for food is filled with the beef products we produce here in the United States. Consumer trust is that one thing that I believe is most important and can drive profitability the most. I didn't say it's going to be easy to change, but let's look at just the revenue side of the equation, because costs are really hard to control much more in a lot of instances. If revenue is a function of, at the cow-calf level, of weaning rate, weaning weight, and calf value is a function of really the quality or genetics of that animal, how that animal is marketed, and in the markets themselves. And if the domestic market is 85% of the destination for our beef and export markets is 15%, and this marketing area is really where we have the greatest opportunity. So I think number one, export market expansion. And to do that, we've got to maintain or still increase product quality. And it's also a function of policy and trade negotiations, probably even more so. And how do we get there? Yeah, probably identification systems, process and practice verification. Those types of things are going to help us in negotiating trade deals to have export markets for our beef to rise its value. I think secondary is actually the domestic market. It's a function of product quality and consistency. But what we really need to focus on here is the social acceptance. And that's driven by cattle handling practices and cattle well-being, the perceptions of environmental impact. But I think what's important is each one of these items that are going to really drive market expansions and doing well in our domestic markets, it's a function of consumer trust. I think it comes down to this: our license to manage land and livestock and water and wildlife and to sell food products will be valid only if we maintain social trust. This is where our greatest leverage lies. Now, it's not going to be easy to increase trust because it's complicated. But I'll just tell you, in my opinion, as a beef supply chain from start to finish till a consumer buys the product, I believe that we are under investing in this area. Consumer trust is the one thing that we can influence that can change demand, that can lead to greater prices and revenue, and drive profitability, and therefore continuous improvement of the beef value chain. I also mentioned improved cattle management. So as an industry, when we look at this as an entire industry, we have to recognize that some producers are not responsive to financial signals for improvement. We can't change that very well. And we have to ask ourselves the question for our industry is, are the production methods and beef products from those operations continuously improving? If we're going to continuously improve beef production practices and the sustainability of beef, therefore, it's got to be changes at all sectors of the industry, for profit and not for profit. We have to ask ourselves, how do we manage these animals that come from those operations that don't respond to signals, to typical market signals and incentives? We have a challenge there, but there's an opportunity. If we can figure out how to do that well, it helps us improve sustainability. At the beef enterprise level, sustained profitability results from implementing efficient production systems. And those are the systems that are designed to withstand those insults or impacts of drought and other external challenges. We've seen external challenges in the last couple of years, from fire at a packing house to COVID-19 and the disruptions that have occurred. We can't mitigate all of those risks in these production systems, but we can work really hard to build more resilient production systems. I think there's opportunity there. It takes deep thought, and there is no silver bullet. No two production systems are going to be exactly the same because the resources available, the environments of production, and even the market targets for those products from those beef production systems are not the same. So there's no silver bullet. But as individuals, if we can focus on adapting management systems towards improved cattle and natural resources management and to try to capture even more efficiencies, then we may be able to continue this improvement or the continuously improving reinforcing loop. That's what we want to be able to do. Environmentally sound and socially responsible and economically viable. We have to put all three of those together. These must be virtuous cycles. They must be virtuous and not vicious. This whole system works, and we can only produce sustainable beef, truly sustainable beef, according to the triple bottom line, if the production of beef is economically viable. If we don't have continuous reinforcing virtuous cycle going on that lends to profitable beef production within the production system, we can't have beef product that is sustainable. So I'll leave you with this final comment. Continuous improvement cannot and will not occur unless there isn't an incentive and a desire to produce beef that leads to improved management of cattle and natural resources. If producers do not have an incentive to improve, then these virtuous cycles become vicious. If they are vicious cycles, we're only producing beef. It is not sustainable beef. With that, I thank you for your time. I thank you for bearing with me with a lot of complexities and a lot of causal loop diagrams and relationships in one presentation. I hope that at the end of this that what you've gained is a better understanding of When we talk about sustainable beef production, what that means and what has to happen for beef to truly be sustainable as it's described as a triple bottom line. Our producers have to have the incentive to produce beef and to make change. If they do not have that, we cannot have sustainable beef produced. Thank you.
Clay, thanks. That was a fantastic talk, and I had no doubt when we put you on the program that you would help us through this process, because it's not surprising, it's complicated. But I really like the causal loop diagrams to help us break that whole system into pieces and help us think through it. I've brought that up. There's a number of questions that have popped up on the chat box and also on the Q&A segment. So I'm going to pass those along to you. Hope all's well in Kingsville today.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Excellent. So the first one's from Connie, and she's interested in seeing some research, or if you can point us to the increase in business complexity of 6%. I think that goes back to, was that the regulation overhead sort of?
Yeah, it was.
Early on in the talk. Yeah, that was a while ago. So.
That's right. And Connie, that was there was an article published in Harvard Business Review. I believe it was in 2011. They had a whole feature issue on the complexity of business. And I can't remember the name of the group that actually did the work that was cited, but it was 6.7%. But you probably have to look and see how they went about it in terms of methodology and determining how complexity changed. I don't recall that part.
Great. Let's see, what else do we have? Marissa asks, how do you see Canada's role in consumer trust for the U.S. and for the U.S. and Canada, where the majority of our Canadian beef is exported to the U.S.? Let's see if I got that read correctly. I did. Okay.
Yeah, I think we are in this together. If you look at the beef produced in North America, we're in this together. And whether it's U.S. or Canada or Mexico, I don't know that the consumers, if they're going to trust one of the countries, they're going to probably trust all of us. If they're not going to trust one of the countries in those three, they're probably not going to trust any of those countries as well in terms of the beef product. So I think in general, we're in this together, and we have to work on this trust for the products that we produce together.
Yeah, great perspective there. It is, we're great, U.S. and Canada and U.S. and Mexico, great trading partners, and those two sort of act hand in hand. Let's see, there was another question, and Marissa already said thank you so much. So thanks, Clay. Katie asks, when you say increase consumer trust, I hear increased transparency. Do you agree? If so, what would those practices look like?
I think that, yes, transparency is part of how we grow trust. And I think we're relatively committed to that. But I think it goes far beyond that. When I look at consumer trust, when you think about systems thinking, we can work harder at something, but that's not necessarily leverage. That's just working harder. Where we find leverage is where we cross a threshold of impacting social responsibility, the perception of that, impacting how people perceive the trust of our industry. And so we have to work hard enough at a level where where we cross that threshold of positive information about our industry, about our products, about the business that we do. And we've worked hard at that for a decade, 2 decades now, but we've got to work even harder. And transparency is certainly part of that, but just general marketing. Are we marketing who we are and what we do at a level to cross a threshold to change the tide of negativity? That's what I'm mostly talking about. We've got to invest more so that we can cross that threshold of and grow trust that way. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great perspective there. Ashley asked kind of a related follow-up kind of question. It says, how does one bad actor blow up the entire industry or blow up the entire increase in consumer trust we may have achieved over a specified time? And how do we protect against that big shock so it doesn't disrupt the circle?
I think we have to always be on guard. We have to do the best job we can of holding all those in our industry accountable, personally accountable, to the practices that we put in place, to how we raise product. One bad actor is always going to be something that we're challenged with. And I'll go back to one of the things that I mentioned before. If there are some in our industry that don't respond to the market signals, those things that tell them, if I do this better, I'll become more profitable. And as long as we have some that don't respond to some of those signals, then their decisions on how and why they produce products the way that they do are not necessarily controlled in the way that as an industry we would want them to be motivated and incentivized. So we've got to do our best work at always staying on guard. We will probably always deal with some bad actors, somebody that does something they shouldn't have and they get caught in the media with it. And then as an industry, we pay for that. And so I think all that we can do is, every one of us that's on this call, don't ever be that one, nor let those that we work with or around be that one that's doing something that's not appropriate. We've got to police ourselves, and we've got to be committed to it as an industry all the time, 100% of the time, and be able to tell people that as well.
Yeah, so
that answers your question.
Yeah, it's a great response, Clay, and it makes me think of two things. One, it's transparency is about making your practice open and visible, but that also implies then that we have to do the right thing, and we always have to do the right thing to make sure that that we build that trust. And I think trust is a little bit like a piggy bank, and it only takes input at a certain rate, and the only way to rapidly change that rate of output is to break it. And so when there's a break in consumer trust, it's not part of the money runs out, it's a whole bunch of the money runs out, and it takes a long time to build that back. And so making sure we do those things and hold people accountable, I think is a really key concept to this, because it's also trust within our industry, right? Right. There's an external trust factor related to our consumer, but there's also an internal trust or sort of mutually aligned interest aspect that makes us all accountable to each other. So great perspective there. Jed asks an interesting question. Says, will cattle types change in response to the environmental challenges and climate variability?
I don't know if they will change in response to climate variability, but I think if we look at moving from improved management of cattle and to efficiency of production, I think we, especially those that are really in tune to genetics and matching cows to the environment and production systems that fit those environments, we probably can think of operations that if they made a change genetically, their cattle might fit their environment better. And so part of continuous improvement is, as an industry as a whole, how well do we match our cattle to the environment that we're producing in? And so there's opportunities there. So I think as we get better and better for those that are responding to market signals, matching cows to the environment is going to continue to be really important as we approach greater efficiencies of production.
Outstanding. Here's a question. We've got, as you know, a pretty large international contingency tuned in to the BIF online symposium this year. And this one comes from South Africa. Georgette asks, may one develop a technological or digital program from quantified data from all sectors of the industry in order to make these relationships less complex? Also, integrating digital marketing that may enhance desire to produce beef, and also research in the industry in order to improve consumer trust, ultimately targeting profitability and management.
That's what I get for putting a really complex slide up. Now I get an overwhelmingly complex question that I'm not sure quite how to answer. Let me reread this and try to answer it. So the first part of it in general is, can we make this less complex? And I interpret the first part of that question is, can we model this well? We can't just model away the complexity. The complexities will always be there. The challenge with modeling is how good are the assumptions? And when we put a whole lot of assumptions together, and you start making mathematical equations to generate outcomes, we've got to make sure everything is weighted just right. It is very challenging. That part of science is beyond my expertise. There's people that are really good at that are working on things like this to try to model this entire system well. Think about the life cycle assessment. That's modeling part of this, but those models are really complex. They're only as good as the assumptions that we put into them, and it's a challenge. Can it be done? I think it can, but it will be really challenging to do that. The question about integrating digital marketing that may enhance desire to produce beef. And also research in the industry in order to improve consumer trust. I think digital marketing is part of a bigger marketing plan that we must have. This digital marketing is going to be the way that we move consumer trust in our favor by telling our story better and reaching more people. But I think it's only one of the components. And then the last part of that question was, and ultimately targeting profitability and management. I'm not quite sure how that ties into the rest of the question. So you might re-ask that if you'd like a deeper answer on that. Sorry, I couldn't answer that one from what's stated there. Yep. I hope that helped.
Yep, good. Time for just one or two more here. Daryl asks, in your opinion, would our industry be better served by marketing sustainability of beef production to consumers versus particular breeds?
I'm not sure if we're better served by marketing sustainability versus particular breeds. We've seen where marketing of breeds has had value for our industry without a doubt, because it's created some name recognitions that have been good and good for the movement of beef product. I think marketing sustainability, I don't think that we market sustainability in the sense that, hey, we're sustainable. I think we have to describe that well. We have to, just like if you go back to Sean Darcy's talk yesterday, what was the number one thing that people were really concerned with in some of the data he showed? It was the cattle well-being. We need to market cattle well-being. We need to market how well these cattle are treated and therefore perform because of that. We need to market how well we treat our environment and the positive benefits of farmers and ranchers on the land and the things that they're doing for our environment. That does all tie into sustainability, but I think, and this is just a cow nutritionist talking, but I think that people are more interested probably in certain parts of sustainability, maybe not just sustainability as a whole, because I think a lot of consumers, they're worried about the environment. There's others that may be more worried about cattle well-being. we can market sustainability, but we need to market those pieces as well. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective on it. And at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of the sustainability message that gets tied back to a particular brand. That's kind of the way humans work, right? We get affinity to a brand, and in this case, it's brand beef products, right? But they come to know that product. They come to know what to expect from that product, the various attributes that went into making or manufacturing those things. And so I think, as we move along in our evolution of beef products, it's only natural to start to tie more of those sustainability pieces to branding labels, and those it may be added on to existing labels or new sort of products, if you think about it in that kind of mentality. I think an interesting question and perspective. Dr. Mathis, thanks so much for your time. I know you spent a lot of time preparing for this talk, and we really appreciate that. I have emailed all of our attendees, which is no small task, because there's a lot of registrants. We're over 1,300 registrants now for the online symposium. And but I did email them with an update that included a link to a PDF of this particular diagram. So as folks go back, and I'm sure many will, like I will, go back and listen to your talk again, have that at hand to help sort of plot through all the pieces, and really appreciate your thoughtfulness and time you spent putting this together, because it is complicated. And I know, speaking personally, I've got a much clearer understanding of how all the pieces relate and the implications of those moving ahead. So Clay, thanks so much. And we appreciate your time answering questions as well. And look forward to seeing you face to face sometime soon.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
The state of Iowa and Iowa State University are proud to host the 2021 Beef Improvement Federation Annual Research Symposium and Convention. The convention will be located in downtown Des Moines with easy access to the airport, hotels, and local restaurants. Iowa State University is just north with its research and teaching farms. Join us in Iowa and experience how Iowa provides the beef industry with innovation to application.